May 1945. Across the wreckage of Europe, nearly 3 million German soldiers surrendered. Yet for the 20,000 branded as SS, the end of the war marked only the beginning of their ordeal. Identified by blood group tattoos and grilled by Soviet interrogators like Colonel Sergei Goglidze, these prisoners were instantly set apart. For the Soviets, SS status meant guilt by association, and a one-way journey into a filtration system built to judge, punish, or erase. The story of the fate of the SS prisoners in Soviet captivity after 1945 is not just about numbers or names, but about the decisions made in those first silent moments after capture. What sealed the destinies of these men, and why were so few ever seen again? In the spring of 1945, the numbers alone defied comprehension. The Red Army took charge of an estimated 2.5 to 3 million German prisoners of war across the collapsing Eastern Front. Among them, the Waffen-SS stood apart, a force that, at its peak, counted around 900,000 men. Not every SS soldier would be captured, but the Soviets identified between 20 and 30,000 who fell into their hands as the Reich disintegrated. These figures only begin to suggest the scale of the task facing Soviet authorities. In the ruined cities and along muddy roads, columns of prisoners stretched for miles. Infantrymen, tank crews, cooks, and clerks, all stripped of their weapons and waiting for orders. Within this mass, the SS were a visible minority, but their presence was unmistakable. Their uniforms, insignia, and the telltale blood group tattoos marked them for special scrutiny. The challenge was not simply to detain such numbers, but to distinguish the men who had served in the SS from the millions of ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers. Soviet screening teams operated at makeshift collection points, railway sidings, abandoned barracks, open fields, recording names, ranks, and units at a pace that sometimes blurred the line between order and chaos. For many, the process was a matter of hours. For the SS, it could stretch into days of repeated questioning and inspection. Some tried to blend in, tearing off insignia or hiding tattoos, but the system was designed to catch them. Soviet officers relied on captured documents, informant testimony, and physical evidence to build their lists. The result was a filtration process that, in its earliest days, swept up tens of thousands, but always with the SS at the center of suspicion. These raw numbers, millions in captivity, thousands pulled aside for their SS affiliation, set the stage for what followed. The rapid sorting, the interrogations, and the decisions that would determine whether a prisoner faced hard labor, trial, or oblivion. At the edge of each captured city, the Soviets established filtration points, temporary hubs where the fate of every prisoner would be decided in minutes or hours. Here, the process was methodical, almost clinical. Prisoners were lined up, stripped of coats and shirts, and ordered to present their left arms. The search for the blood group tattoo, a small, inked marking on the upper arm, became routine. For the NKVD, this was a signature of the Waffen-SS. Some men tried to cut or burn the tattoo away, but fresh wounds only drew more suspicion. Others, caught with forged documents or missing identity cards, faced even closer scrutiny. Soviet officers, clipboard in hand, checked names against captured German rosters and blacklists compiled from intelligence reports. Registration cards were filled out for each prisoner, recording every detail: name, rank, unit, scars, tattoos, and any medals or insignia still attached. The paperwork was endless, but mistakes could be fatal. A single denunciation from another prisoner, a whispered accusation, a coerced confession, could tip the scales. Interrogators pressed for admissions, offering the faint hope of leniency in exchange for information. Most prisoners understood that silence was dangerous, but speaking could be worse. Committees known as komissii reviewed each file, weighing physical evidence against testimony and documents. Their decisions mapped out the next step: assignment to a regular labor camp, transfer to a special investigation unit, or referral for trial as a suspected war criminal. Appeals were rare, and successful ones rarer still. The process was not uniform. Some camps were stricter, others chaotic, but the essential logic remained the same. In this system, a tattoo, a name on a list, or a single confession could mean the difference between survival and oblivion. The bureaucracy moved quickly, and by the time the trains were ready for departure, the SS had been separated from the rest, marked for a different journey, one with no promise of return. The journey from the filtration depots to the camps began on foot. In the first months after surrender, columns of prisoners, many still in their field uniforms, some without boots, were marched for days toward distant railheads. The weak stumbled in mud or snow, the sick dropped out and were left behind. In winter, the march from Kirov to Vorkuta became a test of human limits. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees. Those who fell were not given a second chance. Survivor diaries recall the sound of gunfire at the rear, the silence that followed, and the bitter wind that swept across the line. At the stations, the ordeal continued. Prisoners were herded into cattle cars, 40 or 50 to a wagon, with barely enough space to sit. The doors were bolted shut. For hundreds of miles, the trains rattled north toward Vorkuta, Kolyma, or the camps of the Komi Republic. Food was scarce, water even scarcer. At each stop, the guards opened the doors only to remove the dead. Soviet rail manifests from 1946 record entire transports losing a third of their number before reaching their destination. The stench inside the wagons was overwhelming. Some men scratched messages onto the wood, hoping someone might one day read them. For many, the journey itself was a death sentence. Official figures from the winter of 1946 report thousands of corpses offloaded at rail sidings along the Arctic route. Survivor accounts speak of friends who died quietly in the night, and of guards who counted the living with indifference. The march and the rail journey thinned the ranks before the camps even came into view, stripped, beaten, forgotten. At Venino, the journey took a new and more uncertain turn. Prisoners who survived the rail transports found themselves herded onto the decks of rusted cargo ships. The holds below were bare steel, unheated, and dark, spaces designed for coal, not for human cargo. The sea route to Magadan was infamous even among Soviet guards. Official manifests from 1947 note that on some crossings, more than a third of those loaded at Venino never disembarked alive in the Far East. Holds packed beyond capacity stank of sweat and sickness. Water was rationed, sometimes withheld for days when storms battered the ships. Food, when it came, was a handful of dry bread tossed through a hatch. The cold seeped into bones. At night, the temperature in the holds dropped close to freezing, and men huddled together for warmth, their breath hanging in the air. Disease spread quickly: dysentery, pneumonia, and lice. Medical logs from the Magadan intake camps record outbreaks that killed dozens on a single voyage. Guards, fearing infection or revolt, rarely ventured below deck. When a prisoner died, there was no ceremony. The body was dragged away and, if the ship was far enough from shore, thrown into the Sea of Okhotsk. Survivor accounts mention the dull splash, the silence that followed, and the knowledge that each day at sea narrowed the ranks further. The Venino, Magadan corridor became a legend among prisoners, a place where hope faded with every wave. Arrival in Magadan offered no relief, only the promise of forced labor in the mines and forests beyond the port. For those who endured the crossing, the ordeal had only changed its shape. At dawn, the sirens sounded for roll call. Prisoners, still weak from the journey, lined up outside the barracks, some barefoot, others wrapped in rags against the cold. The guards counted heads, then barked orders. Each man received a chunk of black bread and a ladle of watery soup. The daily ration, measured at 12 to 1,500 calories, barely covered the effort demanded by the day's work. The camps of Vorkuta and Kolyma became names whispered with dread. Here, SS prisoners joined thousands of others in the mines and forests. Coal dust filled the air. In winter, men swung pickaxes with numb hands, their breath freezing in the dark. In summer, swarms of mosquitoes tormented the weak. Timber crews dragged logs through knee-deep mud. Some worked on railway lines, laying steel across the permafrost. Disease spread faster than hope. Tuberculosis and dysentery swept the barracks. The infirmary, if it existed, was a single room with a few cots and no medicine. Men collapsed at their posts, too weak to stand. Those who could not work were marked for reduced rations. The sickest often starved within weeks. In the worst years, the death rate soared. Records from Vorkuta in 1946 and 1947 show that nearly half of new arrivals did not survive their first winter. Survivors remembered the silence of the night, broken only by the coughs of dying men. A few tried to keep spirits alive with whispered stories or scraps of song, but most learned to measure time by the next roll call, the next bowl of soup, the next name missing from the line. In the barracks at Special Camp 27 near Krasnogorsk, the day's labor was not always measured in timber or coal, but in hours spent under fluorescent lights, facing the blackboard. Soviet officers, some in uniform, others in civilian coats, delivered lectures on the evils of fascism and the triumph of the Red Army. Attendance was mandatory. Prisoners sat in rows, their faces blank, as a parade of speakers recited the history of German aggression, the suffering of Soviet civilians, and the promise of a new socialist order. The message was clear. Redemption depended on public renunciation of the past. Each week, the schedule included confession sessions, rituals of self-criticism staged before the assembled camp. Prisoners were called to the front, sometimes at random, sometimes as punishment. They stood on splintered floorboards and recited rehearsed statements, admissions of guilt, declarations of remorse, pledges to reject Nazi ideology. Guards watched for hesitation. A poorly delivered confession could mean a missed meal or extra duties. Diaries recovered from Krasnogorsk described the anxiety of these sessions, the pressure to say enough but not too much, to avoid suspicion from both guards and fellow inmates. The curriculum at Camp 27 extended beyond lectures. Prisoners copied propaganda pamphlets by hand, debated Soviet news bulletins, and wrote essays on their transformation. Some complied out of fear. Others hoped that visible cooperation might earn a transfer to lighter work or a chance at early release. A few, especially the youngest conscripts, began to echo the slogans in private, uncertain whether belief or survival mattered more. For most, the classroom was another form of captivity, a space where the struggle shifted from physical endurance to the slow erosion of identity. In the aftermath of the war, the Soviet authorities moved swiftly to formalize the guilt of those they held responsible for the crimes of the Third Reich. The Nuremberg Tribunal had already declared the SS a criminal organization in 1946, a ruling that cast a long shadow over every captured member, regardless of rank or personal history. For the Soviets, this provided both legal justification and political mandate. The machinery of justice was set in motion, not only in Germany, but across the territories liberated by the Red Army. In Riga, the Soviet Military Tribunal convened one of its most publicized war crimes trials. Over 8 days in January and February 1946, senior SS and police officials, among them Friedrich Jeckeln, infamous for his role in the Baltic massacres, stood in the dock. The charges ranged from mass murder to forced labor and deportations. Evidence came in many forms: captured German documents, eyewitness testimony, and crucially, confessions extracted during months of NKVD interrogation at Lubyanka prison in Moscow. These statements, often obtained under duress, were read into the record as proof of both individual and collective guilt. The sentences were delivered without hesitation. All but one of the accused were condemned to death and hanged in the city where their crimes had been committed. For thousands of lesser-known SS prisoners, the process was less visible, but no less severe. Soviet tribunals, operating in Berlin, Minsk, and throughout the occupied zones, handed down sentences of 10, 15, or 25 years of hard labor. Many never saw a courtroom. A signature on a confession or a name in a file was enough. The Soviet legal apparatus moved with deliberate force, codifying guilt in a system where the outcome was rarely in doubt. In September 1955, the question of the last German prisoners in Soviet camps moved from silent despair to the negotiating table. Konrad Adenauer, Chancellor of West Germany, arrived in Moscow determined to secure their return. The Soviet leadership, Bulganin, Khrushchev, Molotov, received him with formality, but also with calculation. For a decade, the fate of thousands had hung on the balance of Cold War politics. Now the Soviets saw advantage in recognition from Bonn, and Adenauer saw a chance to end the long wait for families across West Germany. The talks were tense. Memoirs from the delegation recall hours of standoff, the weight of unspoken grievances filling the rooms. On September 13th, after days of negotiation, the two sides announced an agreement. Diplomatic relations would open, and the Soviets would begin releasing the remaining German prisoners, including those classed as war criminals. The lists included men sentenced by tribunals, as well as those who had labored for years in the Arctic camps. Amnesty for most came not from the courtroom, but from political calculation. By early 1956, the first trains crossed into West Germany. Survivors, many gaunt, some barely able to walk, stepped onto home soil after a decade in captivity. Crowds gathered at the stations, holding signs with names, searching each face. For the returnees, the journey's end was both relief and reckoning. The lobbying of groups like Hayag had kept the question alive, but it was Adenauer's deal in Moscow that finally opened the gates. For thousands, the war truly ended on the day the train doors slid open and the cold Soviet winter was left behind. Between 1945 and 1955, more than 20,000 identified SS prisoners passed through Soviet filtration camps and labor colonies. Official records and survivor accounts reveal that up to 60% of this cohort died from starvation, disease, and harsh conditions before repatriation began. The Nuremberg verdict of 1946 and the Riga trials codified collective guilt, while Soviet archives document both the bureaucratic precision and the brutality of the process. Yet, Soviet files on individual interrogations and mortality remain partially classified, and the true scope of coerced confessions is still debated by historians. The last major transport of SS prisoners returned to Germany in February 1956, following Chancellor Adenauer's negotiations. Today, official German and Russian records acknowledge the suffering, but differ on legal and moral responsibility. The fate of SS prisoners in Soviet captivity stands as a documented chapter of post-war reckoning, marked by systematic retribution, enduring secrecy, and the unresolved legacy of justice after total war.